Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, and welcome to OEG's April webinar. We're a little bit later in the month than we usually are, but it's good to see many of you still with us today. We're looking today at whether we finally turned a corner in terms of traveller confidence. Certainly it's been good to hear of the easing of lots of travel restrictions, particularly in Asia the last few weeks. And at least anecdotally, Europeans seem to be flying again in large numbers. I know I've enjoyed both leisure trips and work trips in the past month or so, and I know I'm not the only one. So let's move on and get into the webinar. We're going to be looking today at some of the patterns of recovery we're seeing around the world. We usually start the webinar with that, and we'll be looking for some good insights there, what's happening in different parts of the world. We're going to then have a look at how airline networks are being changed a bit, particularly to account for the closure of Russian airspace, but we'll look at a few other angles as well. We're going to move on to look at some of the prospects for bookings in the summer, see what the OEG booking data is showing and telling us about how bookings are coming along. And then we'll finish off with a look at a possible JetBlue Spirit merger or takeover or whatever the latest formulation is. With me today, I've got John Grant and Deirdre Fulton. We were expecting to have Wilco from Amsterdam Schiphol Airport, but unfortunately he had to tell us today that he's not going to be able to make it. So Deirdre, who's one of the usual hosts for this webinar, has kindly stepped in. Good to have you with us today, Deirdre. We don't normally both do this, do we?
Thank you. Yes, it's slightly bizarre for both of us to be on, but no difficult questions, please. Or I'll there'll be payback down the line for that. No, happy to be here and interested to have the discussion as we go on over the next hour. Thank you.
Yeah, and John, always good to have you with us, OEG's resident chief analyst. You produce a blog every week, and this one was particularly upbeat, wasn't it?
Yes. Hi. Good afternoon. Good morning, everyone. Yeah. Very upbeat. I think we probably are now in that recovery phase in 80% of the global markets. So yeah, no reason to look pessimistically at anything at the moment. Omicron seems to be passing through pretty quickly in most places. Yeah, it's all good news, Becca.
Good. We're going to have a really lovely positive webinar today. So it makes a change, doesn't it? 2 years of looking through all the gloomy news. So let's try and keep that going forward. If you're listening into this, please do put your questions in the chat area. We love taking your questions, and we try and pick them up as we go through and weave them into the conversation, weave them into the chat, sometimes answering them directly. So do send your questions in. Anything we say, if it prompts a thought or prompts a question, we'd like to hear that. So let's make a start. First of all, where are we globally at the moment in terms of capacity? We usually look at capacity. The airline schedules are the sort of thing that OEG has always been known for. So we start with a look at schedule data, number of seats. And the yellow line here is what we've seen so far this year, and where it becomes dotted is capacity going forward in the schedule, looking a little bit higher. But John, you're not thinking this is the yellow line is going to hit the black line this year, are you?
I think there's more chance of Everton staying in the Premier League than there is of that occurring, Becca. It's a big gap. In 2019, this week was 109 million. We're at 88.6, as you say now. We can identify around another 6 million seats of capacity that was in the Chinese domestic market last year that isn't there now because of their attempts at a zero COVID strategy. But apart from that, many markets have come back quite strongly in the last 6 weeks, and airlines are maxed out in terms of available resources. We have challenges within the whole travel ecosystem in recruiting staff, renewing SI passes, renewing operating certificates, all sorts of things. And the airline industry doesn't seem to want to really burst through and go much above 95 million seats in the summer season. And quite frankly, who can blame them? You know, we've seen stop-start travel restrictions from governments, senseless traffic light systems that ultimately were proven to be a failure and distorted how people travelled. And the airlines are conscious of the price of fuel. They don't want to put too much capacity in. They're yield managing. They're looking to increase airfares and have a really strong summer. And you're not going to have a strong summer if you keep adding more and more capacity back. You'll just dilute yields and chase revenue, and that's not a game anyone wants to really play.
And we know that some of this capacity we're seeing going forward in the next few weeks is going to come out anyway, isn't it? And that's we'll move on to that. Actually, maybe we haven't got a slide on China. We do a webinar in the morning and we had a China slide there, but some of that is Chinese capacity that's in the schedule, and the Chinese airlines at the moment are just taking capacity out for the next week or 2 weeks, aren't they? And we know that it's going to take longer for the current restrictions to work their way through the system in China. And so there's such a large part of the market. There's quite a lot of capacity to come out still, isn't there?
There is. It's you know, China is holding many other parts of Northeast and indeed Southeast Asia back from recovery because it traditionally was a very large part of their market. The Chinese airlines at the beginning of COVID flipped a lot of international capacity to domestic services, but you know, they're in this current outbreak of Omicron that's in Shanghai, and they're in their 5th week of a serious lockdown. Shanghai's airports are both running at less than 50% of their normal capacity, and that has a knock-on effect into other cities within China. And of course, we're now beginning to hear of panic buying in Beijing, residents being asked to do 3 PCR tests a week, and a you know, suspicion that there's going to be lockdowns in parts of Beijing as well, which will just keep setting it back. It's really hard to be an airline operating in that environment. Chinese carriers are a better place than any other nationality, though, to actually overcome this. You know, in Western Europe and in Asia, generally airlines laid off staff. In China, they kept the staff on board, reduced their salaries, but did keep them on their payroll. So they can bounce back quicker. They've got the aircraft to do it. It's just having confidence and being told by the government that they can reopen services, and then they'll start straight away.
It is quite remarkable.
The other interesting, Becca, I think the other interesting thing is that overlaying all of that, and we're seeing it really evidently, aren't we, in China because of the zero case strategy, but COVID is still an issue. It's still an issue in markets. You know, despite Australia declaring the pandemic was over, and to all intents and purposes, the UK and parts of Europe have done the same, it's still affecting resourcing for airlines and airports, and you know, everybody in the travel ecosystem. And it might not be as severe as it was, but it's still having an impact. So I think there's that challenge to manage as well.
Yeah. That plays to a question we just had from Andreas, who asked, you know, will travel confidence be torpedoed? Interesting use of the word there, Andreas, in an aviation webinar. But you know, the events we're seeing in Manchester and Amsterdam and such places, will it damage consumer confidence? I think the answer is no, it won't. And I think we need to really get into context what is happening. This is an industry where capacity in Western Europe is now 4 times bigger than it was in the same week in 2021. There is no industry in the world with the rules, regulations, crazy government requirements in some places, lack of infrastructure in governments to process security requirements. And you know, that has its knock-on effect into the airline industry. But
I do wonder though, John, whether I think you're perhaps slightly more optimistic than me, because I think for many people traveling over Easter, that might have been their first flight or their first overseas flight in 2 years. And actually to have the experience that some travellers have had across Europe, then I wonder what the knock-on effect of that will be with people thinking, is this going to get better? Are we confident enough to book for the summer? Is the experience not going to quite match up to the expectation?
I think ultimately, Deirdre, people will still want to travel. You know, I mean, you hear that quite a few people were turning up at security points who had still got liquids in their bags because they'd forgotten the protocols. You know, and all of those things are the teething problems of the airline industry. As I said to someone yesterday, you know, about travel advice. Typically, we used to say, make sure you travel on the first departing flights of the day because the aircraft is probably going to be there from an overnight stop, and you'll get away on time and everything will be fine. The later in the day you leave it, the more chance that your flight will be delayed. Given that we're only running at about 80% of capacity, and punctuality at the moment is generally very good for most airlines when they operate the flight, my advice would be actually travel on the second or third departing flight of the day when the queues are not so severe at the airport, when there is a greater distribution of departing flights during the day rather than a heavy concentration in the first couple of hours. You know, there's a travel tip that people might want to think about if they haven't already booked, you know, and if you have to wait 30 minutes in the context of waiting two years to travel, is it really that painful?
Do you think, John, there's a discussion to be had around how airlines and airports communicate this to travellers, so to avoid this sort of sense of you know, the travel experience being torpedoed by the chaotic situation? Do they need to do a better job of explaining what is happening and the fact that you just can't double capacity at an airport within a short space of time? It just doesn't work like that.
I think they could always do a better job. I mean, they could have done a better job through the whole pandemic, Becca, but equally, you know, some of the sensationalist journalism that we've seen around this and pictures that actually weren't taken on the day, but were taken a couple of years ago and have been used to demonstrate a point in some cases, just create this furor of sort of media sensationalism. And yes, it has been a challenging period for the airlines, and the airlines don't want to cancel flights at short notice. But, you know, would you rather a flight be cancelled or sit on an aircraft with 180 other people, knowing that 3 of your crew members are actively, you know, suffering from an Omicron attack at that moment in time? No, you wouldn't. So we just need to be a bit more philosophical about it, or shrug our shoulders and get on the next flight.
John, you're always philosophical. Let's have a look at the trends by region. So taking that data, breaking out, we're showing here capacity versus the same month in 2019, and this red line is China. It's all over the place, but they are different, aren't they, as we've just said, to everywhere else, in that they didn't lay staff off. They can reduce capacity by 50% and bring it back again. But everywhere else, all these other regions, and we've got Asia here in the dark blue at the bottom without China, because it just makes more sense to show it that way. Everywhere else is on an upward trend pretty much, isn't it? The trend is good and positive, and this is good.
Yeah, and this is what we want to see. And, you know, from probably around March onwards, when Omicron had passed through most of Western Europe and the wave was beginning to settle back down again, we've seen growth in capacity, and that's been supported by more and more demand. It is positive. We've clearly got a way to go in each and every market out there, but I think it's probably not going to be before 2023 that many airlines are close to their pre-COVID pandemic capacity production levels. A couple are already ahead of there. Ryanair is a phenomenal example, you know, 14% more capacity this week than there was 2 years ago. I mean, you got to give credit to them when there's, you know, they never miss an opportunity to grow market share and generate more revenues. And they've done a really good job of that in the last couple of months.
And we've seen some good news coming out of Asia this last few weeks, haven't we? Singapore, Thailand, both opening up. think Malaysia's coming. Still not seeing that in Japan, and obviously we're still not expecting China to open till 2023. But in Southeast Asia and Southwest Pacific, it's all moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, you and I were in Singapore a couple of weeks ago, Becca, and it was the first week that the country had effectively removed most of its travel restrictions. I mean, I've never got through Singapore immigration as quickly as I did. It was amazing. And the whole city was in sort of a party holiday mood because everyone was out in the streets. The rooftop bars, as you will remember, Becca, were most evenings. And we've now got Thailand and Singapore completely removed all restrictions. That's going to help. People will be booking from Western Europe back into the Thai market, and Singapore will continue to grow as a major stopover destination. It's great, but it is China that's the problem. You know, until China opens, big markets like Japan, South Korea, who rely on both the local market and also the connecting markets out of China, are going to struggle to come back in any significant shape or form.
Yeah,
I think what jumped out to me about, Becca, on that previous chart was actually the strength of both North America and Latin America, who just didn't seem to be as subject to the degree of variation that other parts of the world had. And I was kind of musing on, is that about having very big domestic markets? But then China's the kind of contrast to that, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Mexico obviously was one of the few countries in the world that is essentially remained completely open during the pandemic and clearly benefited from that. Although looking forward, in some of the booking activity, it's not as strong as it has been in previous years. But I mean, a lot of Latin Americans, as we know, have family VFR connections in the United States. And the US didn't close its borders to those countries during COVID-19. You know, for any European who wanted to get to North America desperately, the route to go was to fly to Mexico, stay there for 2 weeks, and then enter the US as a freely entering citizen. So it's it's good to see that. I mean, and Pakistan is going well, and India at the moment is just, you know, really, really vibrant. Lots of low cost demand, resurgence in travel, couple of new airlines. It's a really strong market. In fact, I think it's probably more exciting and dynamic and going to lead the global recovery ahead of China in the next couple of years.
And certainly across Southeast Asia, all those markets that had come to depend on Chinese outbound travel are now focused on India, aren't they? How do they get a share of the Indian market? How do they, you know, what do they need to do to understand who is going to travel from India and why they'll travel? So
yeah,
interesting stuff. I moved the slide on a bit too early, but so you've been looking at this slide for a while. We thought we'd have a look at what impact the closure of Russian airspace to European airlines is having. And this map here, which is a very strange looking map and a function of the fact that, you know, it's a flat two-dimensional thing, and the globe is spherical or nearly spherical. So this shows routes from by Finnair to Asia, and the routes to Tokyo, to South Korea are currently being flown over the pole, the North Pole, which is why we've got these sort of strange lines up at the top that look like they're very, very long. But it is taking to Tokyo about 3.5 hours longer than it used to. Flights to Southeast Asia are taking a bit less time. They're taking a more southern route. Airlines based further west in the UK, France, Germany are not as affected by the closure of Russian airspace, but it's particularly affecting Finnair and the Helsinki hub that they've built up there, never mind the fact that China's closed as well. Really massive impact, and really takes away their competitive advantage, doesn't it, John?
Everything that they had as part of their competitive position has disappeared. The Great Circle route, quick journeys, And that's why, you know, we've seen Finnair offer no guidance on their financial forecast for the year end. It's why they're switching more and more capacity into places like Stockholm and launching services to the United States so they can use the aircraft there. But this is, at the moment, you know, airlines have been able to wear this situation for a few months. In the winter, it will become increasingly difficult because the trade winds become more pronounced and the journey times will become slightly longer. And, you know, that's not good. And the price of fuel obviously is quite high at the moment, and airlines are increasingly concerned about that. But it's as much about how these types of increases in block times, Becca, impact connectivity and impact aircraft integrations across the fleet, and the things that you can do there. I think it's, you know, and you've got a slide that shows it, a couple more on. This is a real challenge for some airlines, and it could radically change the way they look at both the Russian market, of course, but perhaps more strategically, the Chinese market. Does a European airline, a Western European airline, when corporate demand is down by 20 or 30%, unlikely to recover back to previous levels, does those airlines want to be allocating aircraft to fly to China or to Japan with lengthy reroutes that mean they've got to allocate more aircraft time? That's going to be a difficult question for them.
And of course, the China's pretty much closed at the moment, but when that does reopen, the Chinese airlines, they still have traffic rights over Russia, as do other Asian airlines. So it's sort of it's a very one-sided distortion of the market or effect on the market. Are we going to see more partnerships between European and Asian airlines so that the Asian airlines operate the routes?
Well, I think we have to, you know, I mean, one of the many peculiarities of Russian en route navigation charges is that they have different prices for different airlines in different countries. So, you know, Western European airlines have always been penalized, and it is an extremely expensive piece of airspace for them to overfly. In any sort of settlement of the current disputes, you can only imagine that price is going to go higher, which is going to make the cost of operating more expensive. And if you've got a Chinese or a Japanese or a South Korean partner in an alliance who could operate those services instead of you, and you reallocate your aircraft to more North Atlantic flying or more Latin American or African services, then I think many of the major Western airlines will be saying, do I need to do double daily Beijing? Do I need to fly to a secondary city in China that I used to fly to? Or should I just strike a deal with my partner airline who's based in that market and let them operate the service, and I'll take the feed and the connecting traffic when it arrives in my hub? So we might see a lot of changes taking place here, and that will shape out in the next couple of years.
So we've had a question in about what impact all of this has on North American airline networks. In a way, it probably doesn't, does it? Other than, I know anecdotally, I've heard that there's fewer Americans wanting to travel to places like Finland. It's just perceived as too close to an area where there's conflict. So are you getting any sense that there's an impact for North American carriers?
Not in their European networks at the moment. I mean, Delta and United and American all put on additional summer frequency flying into Mediterranean destinations, places like Barcelona and Venice and Athens, and all of those routes are starting. So that's still the normal pattern. A lot of that activity is related to cruise ship demands and trips around the Mediterranean. So I think that will continue. US carriers are still operating into India with a routing that takes them over my house at about 5 o'clock every morning. So it's every airline's finding a solution to the problems they have at the moment, Becca, and there's no reason to believe American airlines are more sensitive about the European market than they were this time last year.
Yeah. Okay, so looking at this data in a slightly different way, I've borrowed some data from, it's come to me via Finavia. So I was talking before the webinar with Petri Vuori, who's handles route development at Helsinki Airport. And we had been hoping to have him on the webinar, but he's not available today. But he had this slide from Eurocontrol, which looks at the same issue and shows 4 different airports in Europe and how the flight times have changed since before. The issue with the Russian airspace and after. And though everywhere we can see the flight times have increased, you know, at Amsterdam, the Seoul flight times have, this yellow line here, have gone up. We really see here the effect for Helsinki is more than anywhere else. And for some routes, there's not really been any change at all. So I thought there was a nice but slightly different way of presenting this this information.
It is.
It really illustrates the challenge, doesn't it?
Yeah, really scary for Helsinki, isn't it? I mean, obviously it's nearly all Finnair service, but just generally, I mean, those increases in sector lengths, average journey times, additional fuel burn, it's daunting, not sustainable over a very long period of time, I think.
And I think that our next slide, also from Finavia, shows just what that means in practice. And I know you, a moment ago, John, sort of referred to this really. So on the left here, we've got a Helsinki Tokyo flight schedule, which could neatly be wrapped into a period of less than 24 hours, which was, it's great scheduling, isn't it? But now the aircraft sits on the ground in Tokyo for 9 hours in order to come back in for the departure, morning departure wave at Helsinki into Western Europe, meaning it's out for 35 hours. That's not sustainable, is it? That's a.
It doesn't get any less surprising, this. Every time I see this slide, I think this is the 3rd time. I mean, it almost makes this kind of operation unworkable, doesn't it? When you think about crewing
it's absolutely, it's horrible. I mean, sometimes you see things like this in other markets where there is a consumer preference to operate overnight in both directions. And a classic is London to Johannesburg, you know, where BA and Virgin overnight from Heathrow to Joburg, arrive at 7 o'clock in the morning. The aircraft departs at 7 in the evening. But that's a conscious decision by the airline. And whilst the aircraft's in South Africa, you know, I know that both airlines do light engineering work, and they even do filming on board the aircraft and things like this for various promotional campaigns. So they use the aircraft effectively and get something sorted while they're doing it. This is just disastrous. I mean, for an airline like Finnair, who operates a really tight network and fleet, to suddenly have to find 30-35% more production means that you've got to have 30 to 35% more wide-bodied aircraft, and you're not going to, you're not going to find them. And do you even want to find them when the costs are going to be as high as they are? It's horrible. It's really, really tough for Finnair and Helsinki Airport.
Okay, we were going to try and stay positive, weren't we?
We were, yeah. Let's find some positivity. Ooh.
Yeah, well, there are bits of positivity in all of this, and don't show this slide, Becca.
This is not one of them.
But you know, many airlines are still able to deliver decent on-time performance in these long-haul sectors. So you know that will continue.
Yeah. So staying with a slightly negative theme, cancellations. We have seen a rise in cancellations, haven't we, this month? I know, Deirdre, you've been the one looking at some of this data. What are we seeing here?
Yeah, I mean, this is really building on what we were talking about right at the start. You know, perhaps trying to put a bit of logic over the sensational media stories that have really gone crazy. I mean, typically cancellation rates sit about 1%. We saw globally, and we saw that really fluctuate through the earlier part of the
Can I just stop you? When we talk about cancellations here, these are flights that are cancelled quite short to the a short time before departure, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah,
not cancelled 2 weeks out,
within
isn't it?
48 hours.
Yeah. So, and we obviously saw cancellation rates increase dramatically as everybody tried to work out what was happening, and then they have stabilized again. But what we've seen, and it's really what's been reported in the media, is across Europe, cancellations peaking, really from a combination of factors. It's what we were talking about. It's staff sickness, it's labour disputes in some cases. I saw a story about Poland having to restrict Warsaw airspace because of air traffic control shortages, and that's due to an ongoing pay issue. KLM are having issues with baggage handlers. There was a strike, I believe, last week, and you can see if you look at the Amsterdam figures, that's kind of evident there. So I think what's interesting is to what extent is this the first real test of travel confidence and demand returning, and airports trying to match supply of staff and resources to that. I'd love to think that if we were looking at this in the peak summer period, that this would have leveled out again and things would have got better. And I'm trying to be upbeat and positive, John. It feels a little bit like we're teetering perhaps on the edge of a summer of discontent in terms of queues and congestion at airports, but I'd love to be wrong on that.
Yeah, I mean, we saw this in the US in January and February when there was, a very similar situation as they were reopening once again. And they ended up consciously cancelling flights to basically hold on to hours on operating crews so that they could operate later in the year. There is an element of that taking place here, but one particular airport wasn't helped by its major customer having yet again another IT problem that disrupted their whole operation and caused immeasurable delays and short notice cancellations. Whoever that person is in British Airways, can they just not pull the plug out every night? It's a simple solution to their IT problems.
They're saving money on their electricity bills, John. That's the problem.
Exactly. I mean, as a shareholder, guys, just don't pull the plug out. But it's a function of the reopening of Europe, that the infection rates of COVID, and there is a parallel here because we did look at the data earlier on this afternoon. There is a correlation between the rate of COVID infection per 1,000 in all of these countries and the high levels of cancellation that did take place. And as they're coming down again, so dispatch reliability is improving, and the airlines have taken capacity out. British Airways have cut capacity for the summer. They've dropped some routes that they were going to operate. They've done what they think they can to mitigate these types of issues in the next few months. Let's hope it all works for them.
And of course, in the US, it's a slightly different story, isn't it? It's more about there's obviously there are obviously sort of short-term, immediate staff illness issues, but there's a pilot issue, isn't there, in terms of actually matching demand for pilots to supply and getting back all of the people that were let go or early retired through the pandemic back into the system. That's taking time, isn't it?
And it's going to take a long time because many senior pilots retired during the pandemic, decided that the lifestyle wasn't for them anymore, certainly in the US market, and filling that gap. There used to be a pipeline where people would come from regional airlines and then move on to the mainline carriers, but they don't have the hours because the qualifying criteria for operations have remained broadly the same, but changes to the number of operating hours allowed by regional airlines means that there is this blockage in the system and people cannot come through the normal sort of career progression journey that they would have. And we see this in all of the carriers, and some of them did attempt to over deliver in terms of production. too quickly and got burnt. And you know, Bernard Lavelle has pointed out JetBlue and Spirit were some of those, and JetBlue are taking steps now to reduce their program at JFK. They're talking about hiring more staff.
It's a 10% reduction, isn't it, in their summer schedule?
Yeah,
they just announced.
Yeah, you know, and ultimately, if they're doing that, you know, they've got to trade off 10% less production, but they've still got essentially a large part of those fixed costs will still be there and need to be covered some way. Is that by higher airfares? And then
I was just about to say we're going to see airfares going up, aren't we?
Yeah, we get back to the blog I wrote a couple of months ago where I said, you know, are we prepared to accept higher airfares for lower productivity from airlines and a greater degree of dispatch reliability and on-time performance? And the answer is no, we won't. You know, as consumers, we want the best of both worlds.
And that, you know, if you match that against inflation being higher than it's been for a long time, consumer confidence in the UK, there was a report out just this week, I think, about consumer confidence is at its lowest point since 2008, because, you know, utility prices are going up, petrol prices have gone up, etc., etc. Just to some extent, we're seeing a similar story in the US. Then, you know, that does not create an environment where people are prepared to pay more for big ticket purchases like travel, or, you know, discretionary purchases like travel.
Although there's, you know, as I've said before, there's a lot of pent up savings around, Deirdre. As we go to the summer, are people quite so conscious about their heating bills that will, you know, begin to escalate in October and November of this year? And you can only buy so many white goods with the money you've saved before you've got a kitchen full of fridges and freezers.
Very true. Very true.
Lovely. Okay, let's move on and have a look at something else. One of the questions when we think about this webinar, one of the questions that we had was, were we seeing airlines flock to routes where there was demand, where that pent-up demand is coming back? And we'd heard from somebody that some routes are getting a lot more airlines and they're becoming more competitive as airlines chase demand. So we've had a look here at some European international routes, and then some North American routes on the right-hand side at the top, and some Latin American routes. So admittedly, a lot of the Latin American ones and North American ones are domestic routes, so I don't know if that makes a difference. But the evidence here is we're not really seeing any consistent trend in terms of the number of airlines operating on routes. And you know, usually we're trying to find some insight and some piece of a nugget out of the data that tells us something new. But in a sense, this time we've actually just found that there isn't evidence for the hypothesis. So, John, does this sit right with you, or are we looking at the wrong route here?
Becca, I mean, you know, if these are very dense routes. You know, these are highly competitive routes. These are routes with established carriers who've been on them for decades in many cases. And some of them may even today still be slot constrained to a degree. Why would you, as a new airline or as an existing airline, want to go into this market and compete on those city pairs when you could actually, you know, be attacking the market at a secondary airport and taking advantage of either better departure times or just offering a new option to the market? So it doesn't really surprise me. I mean, if I was, heaven forbid, still in an airline, I'd think long and hard before taking on KLM and British Airways on Amsterdam Heathrow, for instance, or entering the Atlanta-Orlando market where a very large proportion of the traffic is connecting. And if you're not, you know, if you're not a mass market carrier at that airport with significant size and scale, you're only serving the local market, you're going to get hammered by Delta and by Southwest. So you just wouldn't bother doing it.
Right. Okay, that's answered that one. Let's look at pricing. We've had a few questions that have asked about pricing and about fuel, and we've talked a little bit about the higher cost of fuel. On the left-hand side here, we've got the familiar chart, I'm sure to many of you, from IATA, showing the jet fuel and crude oil price per barrel, with this large significant spike that's just happened. Jet fuel prices are, really very, very high at the moment. 126% up on a year ago, which was already, I think, relatively high. And on the right, what we're seeing is, I've just taken a selection of routes here from the ITA matrix, which gives you a chance to see the breakdown of all the different items that make up an airfare. So the airline fare, the taxes, fees, charges, and also we're increasingly seeing fuel surcharges. So on the transatlantic, where demand seems to be pretty buoyant at the moment, we're seeing fuel surcharges of £240, €240. Not so much in terms of fuel surcharges elsewhere. Within Europe, where we're seeing them, and in Asia, they tend to be a bit lower, as we'd expect, where demand can't manage that sort of higher airfare. But I think in the last week, we saw AirAsia add fuel surcharges. Last week, Japan Airlines announced they were going to add fuel surcharges. Is this with us to stay, John, or is this just, is this only workable while there's this pent-up demand that's being serviced over the summer, and we've got some routes where plenty of people want to travel?
I think it's a reflection of those markets that are in a stronger state of recovery than others. So we're seeing this across the Atlantic. Delta, a couple of weeks ago, made it very clear that they will be passing this on. And let's not forget, Delta have got their own oil refinery. So if they're passing it on, everyone else is going to be passing it on as well. And Air Canada are doing the same. And you can see here the sort of level of surcharge that's being placed on a ticket at the moment. And the consequence of all of this, Becca, is that airfares are much higher than they were in 2019, and it's likely to stay that way throughout the summer, particularly on the Atlantic, where there is this large pent-up demand. Don't forget, people are still using travel vouchers that they were issued with 18 months ago. So all of those have got to be fulfilled and accommodated if at all possible.
And tell me, John, do fuel surcharges get applied to a travel voucher?
They may well do. I don't know the answer to that, but I would think that you could well be on, the airline could well be looking to charge that, pass it through. Absolutely, because it's a voucher for what the fare was when you purchased that ticket, not for what the fare is today. So if you paid £700 and the airfare is now £900, you've still got to, I believe, pay the differential of £200. But do you pay the differential, or do you lose the £700?
Yeah, that's the position, isn't it? When you've been trying to take this trip for 2 years, 2 years already.
Yeah, and to that point, that's why we see these fuel surcharges being applied here and in Western Europe and in North America, but not so much in Southeast Asia, where the market is still trying to recover, where consumer confidence is low, where demand is low relative to capacity, and airlines are saying, we can't pass this through. It's the elasticity in the market is not there. This will stop any demand that we have seen coming back. And only when the market in a stronger place will we see airlines able to apply those fuel surcharges. But I think,
sorry, John, I was just going to ask about hedging. To what extent are airlines in the transatlantic market hedged on fuel?
Pretty well. All of them have got good hedges in place. This is where they buy at a fixed price in the market, hoping that they've managed to secure a price below the market rate on the day of travel or the day of service. Most of them are well placed, Deirdre, The dilemma is going to come, of course, that what do they do with their next fuel hedge? You know, if they're hedging 6 months or 4 months out in advance, if you're buying fuel now, then essentially you're saying, I'm expecting it probably to be about the same price now as it in 4 months' time as it is now. And airlines, the last thing you need to do as an airline is get caught with a bad fuel hedge. There are probably 5 or 6 former CFOs, chief financial officers, who work for Cathay Pacific, who could tell you about the danger of a fuel hedge when it goes in the wrong direction. Cathay lost millions and millions of dollars in various fuel hedges over the years. I understand at the moment they're actually on the right side of a fuel hedge, but you know, a success rate of 1 out of 8 or 1 out of 10 isn't a great rate when you're hedging millions and millions of dollars. And of course,
and somewhat ironic that that's at a time when, you know, they have the lowest passenger numbers they've ever had.
Absolutely, and let's
nothing.
Yeah, for many airlines in Europe, a lot of their costs are still dollar based. You know, aircraft leases still dollar based, fuel prices dollar based, and the dollar has strengthened considerably against the euro and the pound in the last few months, which means just the simple passing on and losses of currency for those airlines have to be mitigated somewhere.
Okay, we've got a little bit of time left. Let's have a look at bookings for the summer. So OAG's traffic analyzer has traffic data that's sourced from Travelport, and as part of that, we have bookings that are in the system for the next however many months. So what we've done here is taken a look at the bookings that were in the system for April to September, this April, and compared it to the same picture a year ago, just to see how bookings are doing compared to this time last year. In many ways, what we'd expect, places like the UK, bookings up 333% versus April last year for April travel, 189% in May. Lots of positive numbers for Canada, which is now open, and Australia, which is now open. This sort of makes sense, doesn't it, John? I mean, I think some of the base numbers are quite low, so perhaps being specific about the percentages isn't too good an idea, but it gives us a good feel for where bookings are strong, and Thailand really, really strong there as well.
Yeah, it's about the sentiment, isn't it? You know, if you go from 10 people in Australia to 35, then it looks a huge number. But the general patterns in most markets are of increasing confidence, more bookings being taken. Obviously, against 2021 is, you know, it was a relatively weak market last year as well. But most of these are beginning to reopen, and that's where I think the confidence is. There is, you know, undoubtedly growth in the market, and people want to travel, and they cannot buy any more microwaves or fridges. So, you know, you take a market like Thailand, where suddenly, you know, it's completely reopened. Essentially, you don't need anything. You can just arrive as long as you've been double vaccinated, and it will, by coming out and making that announcement now, they will secure a lot of forward booking activity into their high season, which is from October through to January, February of next year. So that, you know, it makes a lot of sense for them. The UK, we know, is very strong and is growing back. India has already grown back strongly, so it's all positive, and that's where I think the optimism has to be. I mean, let's not forget, last week, the US airlines on their first quarter earnings reports were saying they expect this summer to be their highest ever revenue generating season in history. Now, if they'd have made that statement 12 months ago, that in 12 months' time they would expect to have such a strong season, you know, the analyst would have ripped them to pieces.
Yeah, but nobody would have believed that. Yeah,
the reality is, you know, that everything you see is making that the case. You know, the markets that stick out, there's not perhaps being as strong as others, places like the United States. Well, that's because there was a lot of travel there last year anyway, particularly domestic. and because it is a notoriously late booking market. And last year people did book late, and I suspect they assume that they will be able to do that again. That might not actually be the case. A lot of those seats will already be full. And of course, now the transatlantic market is open, probably around 20% of the domestic market in the US was connecting passengers making an onward journey to an international flight. You know, someone going from Paris to Chicago and then connecting on to somewhere on the West Coast, for instance. That market is now back. So it may be that some of that US traffic is getting squeezed out by higher yielding system benefit revenues for the airlines as opposed to a local sale.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? We've grappled ourselves with the US numbers and trying to understand them. The Mexico ones that are negative are perhaps easier to understand. So there's the bookings here are to and from Mexico and both points of both ends of the route in terms of sales. And when Mexico was almost the only place open for travel from the US, everyone went to Mexico. So now those people can go somewhere else. So it sort of makes sense that it's bookings are down versus last year. The US is a little harder to get your head around, but I think it's, as John says, it's a whole combination of factors coming together. But we're comparing where we are now versus where we were last year.
What's quite interesting, we've had a question from someone about do we think this booking trend will continue into the autumn and winter? The whole piece around late booking and how the pattern of bookings have changed, I think that's going to be really interesting to watch, isn't it? As if what we're seeing is confidence is returning, then in theory, late bookings should start to diminish, and we should start to move back towards more confidence to book more in advance. But it's hard to call that, isn't it? It's hard really to know. I think it might for some markets, but not for others, perhaps.
And I think where we've got more confidence about travel restrictions and the rules and all of those things. But if people feel like, well, am I going to be faced with another fuel surcharge? Is there going to be an extra £100 for each person in my family to travel? Or if the exchange rate moves against me, there's uncertainty in different places now, which may mean that they're still wanting to book late and just wait and see what happens.
Yeah, I think at the moment, let's not forget also, we have 11 months in which the normal airline booking curves, the priming of the sales pipeline and the revenue pipeline has not been there. And therefore, we've got a lot of seats that are still available in some markets, particularly going into the autumn period. But as that confidence recovers, then people will book. So I still think if you definitely know what dates you want to travel in the autumn, the sooner you book that fare, then the more likely you are to either avoid a fuel surcharge being applied again, or an even higher fuel surcharge, or just prices moving north anyway.
Okay, let's dig down into this data just a little bit more. We've got some countries here, bookings to and from France, to and from Germany, UK and Spain, just to see where people are traveling to and from those particular countries. Just to see, again, we're not wanting to be too precise about the numbers here and the percentages, but just see where booking strength is coming from. And this is looking at June, bookings for travel in June. So Canada looking pretty strong for France, Spain, and the UK, isn't it?
Yeah, it was closed last year, wasn't it, essentially?
Yeah.
And there's
This is really the first year, isn't it, of Canada being open? Yeah,
a lot of VFR traffic going back and forth. So no great surprise there, Becca. It's there's a lot of competition there. You've got Air Transat, WestJet, Air Canada, all of the European legacy carriers. It's a very competitive market anyway. So it doesn't surprise me. I think it's what you really would expect to see.
Okay, let's look at the same for North American markets. We've got Canada, US and Mexico here. Again, seeing strong growth Canada, but that's just a function, as we said before, the fact that Canada was closed a year ago. We've had a question in about the way the airlines are offering services, the sort of cabin products and the customer experience, and is that going to be a driving variable for future purchase? Is that doesn't really affect whether there's bookings or not bookings, is there? But it does perhaps affect the yield that the airlines get.
Sure. I think it's more around, and it will be interesting to see how airlines develop their premium economy product. There was a comment from an airline CFO a few months ago where he said his most profitable cabin on a long haul flight is premium economy, and it can be up to 7 times more profitable than either first or business class on some occasions. And I think a lot of airlines are investing very heavily in their premium economy product because it's a good space at a competitive price point, and there is a market that will pay for that additional piece of space, a bit more width, a bit more legroom, and post COVID we'll want a bit more sort of space in the cabin. So I think getting the right mix of capacity in the right cabin will be important for airlines, and that's why generally we're seeing the demise of first class across the Atlantic and its replacement with business. And American Airlines latest A350 order, I think, has a high density business cabin that is undoubtedly designed for transatlantic routes, because that's where the market will be. And taking out first class seats, what will be really interesting is to see if over the next 2 or 3 years corporate demand really does come back to the 2019 levels that we saw. I think that's still doubtful.
Yeah,
it's a bit ironic though, isn't it? Sorry, Becca. It's a bit ironic that you pay extra for your premium economy seat on the plane, but what was it? Our guest this morning said it was like arriving at Wembley when he landed at Heathrow earlier this week. If you're cheek by jowl in an airport terminal, it doesn't play into the social distancing concept at all, does it? But to your point, John, at the start, we have to find a way to live with this, don't we? And we have to be realistic about accepting that there's inherent risk in anything we do.
Yeah, and quite frankly, I think arriving at Wembley in that environment was probably much better than arriving in Orlando in November when it was akin to Twickenham and a rugby scrum.
So you're losing me now.
Yeah, it's. I think that's just an inevitability of the recovery. We will see these pinch points in the whole industry. It's inevitable.
Okay, time for one more slide. John, I know you wrote a blog about this. JetBlue and Spirit, or Frontier and Spirit? Where is this going to land now? So
it's going to land.
We started off with the possibility of a Frontier Spirit merger, and now it's looking like, and then JetBlue put in a pitch for Spirit. Have I got that the right way around?
Yeah, it is. It's going to land in court. This is great for lawyers and all of those people, lobbyists in Washington, who will be arguing and pleading their respective sides. It's very difficult. I mean, neither of these mergers really moves the needle in terms of where the carriers will get and their networks. The more cultural fit is clearly Frontier and Spirit. They've got very similar operating styles. JetBlue and Spirit is an interesting cultural blend, although JetBlue have gone to pains to produce a really nice glossy presentation that explains how they believe the cultural fit will work, and what benefits they can bring over and above Frontier. But you know what? As much as anything else, I think this is a reflection of confidence in the longer term recovery of the market. And it will, we will see these people coming back. These airlines will be well placed in the future. Both Frontier and Spirit are growing rapidly. They've got very large aircraft orders in place. It will be interesting to see how it shapes out. I'd love to be a consultant working on this, because I can start the stopwatch now and it will probably still be running this time next year.
But either way, we end up with a an airline that is getting closer to competing with the big four in the United States market. So we know you know, you and I, John, have worked on pieces of work before where in other sectors we see the sort of the rule of three, that markets seem to move towards three large players. So this is sort of bucking the trend in a way, isn't it?
It is, but you know, I mean, let's not forget, this is a huge market, and a very geographically disparate market. You know, one end of the States to the other, huge distances. So there's probably room for all at the moment.
Well, that's really interesting. Well, we've hopefully we've managed to answer many of your questions as we've gone through. There's been one or two come through.
Sorry to interrupt. There's a question from David Rogers that was early on, and I think it's an interesting subject. He was asking what's going to happen in the cargo market. Will airlines continue to use passenger aircraft for main deck cargo or main cabin cargo? And I think they won't, David. I think, you know, the revenue opportunity from passengers and the yield is higher than they will get from cargo as the global economy recovers. I do think there will be a continued renaissance of cargo operations from both specialist operators, and I think every legacy airline with wide-bodied equipment now recognises the value that cargo can contribute to their bottom line. So, you know, I think we'll see a bit of a flip, but cargo has quite rightly got a bit more importance and is no longer considered, you know, the dirty part of an aircraft and a revenue stream. So having answered that, David, can I ask you, what will the price of fuel be in 12 months' time?
$64,000 question, that, isn't it?
If we're going to take some questions, the question that we haven't answered so far that it got my interest was came in quite at the end from Pedro. Any prediction on shifting city pair demand given the migratory shift of employees moving to work from home in cities other than where the office is located, and usually hub cities? So, and this may be more of a US dynamic, but I mean, we're definitely seeing that in Europe as well, aren't we? And I certainly know plenty of youngsters who seem to have managed to find an Airbnb to work out of in some nice hot place by the beach for 3 months, rather than working in the city of London. So, is there an impact for aviation there, John? Do you think?
I think in the short term there may be, but it's on the fringes, Becca. You know, I think those big hubs will always be big hubs, and they'll always, they are magnets. They attract people. They attract corporations. You know, we spoke about it this morning. There's increasing migration from a country or an island such as Hong Kong at the moment to Singapore. So there's always going to be shifts, be they for political reasons or just, you know, because of the cost advantage that can be secured.
I think there's a bigger play, isn't there, about how corporate demand's going to recover, almost in some way linked to where people are based now is less relevant to you know, to where the office is, and that of course has a bearing on corporate demand, doesn't it, and corporate travel. So I think it's going to be interesting to see, you know, confidence is back. We were just saying that, corporate demand is still not there yet, but I think over the next 12 months, just understanding how organizations, you know, respond and get back to finding what the optimum is for corporate travel will be an interesting area to watch.
That stigma, be it real or perceived by the employee, you know, that they didn't live near the head office and they needed to move. You know, we can all attest to the power of video conferencing in the last 2 years, and the broader acceptance of you can be just as productive at home as you can in an office, and less disruptive on your colleagues. As you keep telling me, ladies.
Amen to that, John.
Thank you both, Deirdre and John, for all your contributions today. Really helpful. the slide you should be seeing now has a sign up for the blog. If you're not listening, if you're not receiving the OEG blog, then please do sign up for that. All three of us contribute to the blog on a regular basis, and John has a weekly update, which I know is looked for and well read by many people. So do sign up for that. We'll be back on Tuesday, May the 17th. So that's a Tuesday, not a Wednesday, in a few weeks' time. So look out for emails for that and do sign up. Thank you for joining us. And thanks, John and Dick.
Thank
Bye
you. Goodbye.